So, ladies and gentlemen, I threatened my host this evening, Major General Mick Crane, with a discussion of one of the research priorities that we have at the Brookings Institution. There are three. We call them presidential leadership, presidential research priorities. And I'll tell you what the three are, but I'm going to hone in on the one. The first is, for us, my number one priority of the institution is the future of the American and the global middle class. The American population is under a lot of stress right now, as evidenced by the nature of our politics. And it makes almost no difference what else we're attempting in the world today if our own middle class collapses, and we spend a lot of time on that. My second area is examining American leadership in the 21st century and what that really means, particularly at this moment in the politics of America. And the third area, an area that Mick touched on a moment ago, was an area on which I intend to pivot the institution, which is to embrace the realities of the emergence of artificial intelligence and the family of related capabilities, supercomputing, big data analytics, predictive analytics, biotechnology, energetics, nanotechnology, etc. If a think tank is going to be relevant in the 21st century, it's going to have to embrace those profound, fundamental shaping principles and shaping effects of the 21st century, and that technology is the case. But this evening, rather than to go there, I want to talk about American leadership in the 21st century, and I can't do the entire topic justice in the few minutes that we have, so I'm just going to touch on a couple of the major areas and do it in the context of the challenges we face domestically in the United States with respect to our foreign policy right now. So let me say this is a very difficult moment in American history, and certainly in that context, I think, in world history. For us in Washington, each week brings us another layer of events which in another moment in American history would have either been unthinkable or frankly intolerable. And let's just take a look at last week. Last week illustrates, I think, some of this. Sadly, the week culminated with the death of our 41st president, President George Herbert Walker Bush. He was a man of unimpeachable integrity. He was a man of indomitable will. He was a man of unquestionable courage, who would lead America, and by the way, all of America. He would lead America and much of the West out of the Cold War era and into an era with nearly immediate uncertainties that required serious leadership in the world as we progressed from the Cold War bipolar arrangements to the post-Soviet era, and almost immediately the first Gulf War. As president, he and his administration have left a legacy that burns brightly for us, and I think more broadly in the world, as an example of what American and U.S. leadership can mean when it is guided by principle, when it embraces values, and when it is committed to the rule of law. Now, other events last week included the firing by the Russians on Ukrainian vessels, capturing some of the vessels and Ukrainian sailors in the Black Sea, in the Kerch Strait. The culmination of the G20 and this dinner between President Trump and President Xi, and what appears to be a 90-day pause in the so-called trade war between the two countries. Very interestingly, there was a vote in the U.S. Senate of 63 to 37 to limit further U.S. support to the Saudi-led war in Yemen, Yemen being one of the great humanitarian catastrophes on the planet today. And it was, by the way, in playing pool, it was a bank shot as well, if you will, of the U.S. Senate in expressing its disapproval of the Crown Prince's almost certain involvement in the assassination and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, an American resident and a columnist for the Washington Post. This also was a week where we found for the first time in modern American history the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court admonishing the President of the United States, who himself was condemning federal judges and their verdicts for being Obama appointees. We'd never seen this before. And for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to become personally involved was unprecedented. I'll just use that term. And then we had public criticism by our president of the chairman of the Federal Reserve and interest rates. And then we see the realities setting in of the U.S. midterm election, which was indeed, no matter what you hear in Washington, was indeed a blue wave. The outcome of this election was not only a signal about where the 2020 election is liable to go. To me, it was an enormously positive outcome of this election. 49% of the American population voted in an election. That's unusual. The only other two times that in a midterm election we had those kinds of numbers was in 1966 and 1918. And in huge numbers, our female population and our minorities and our youth voted in this election. And so the numbers are often, the numbers of Democrats who were elected is often the subject of the conversation. But when you look at the faces of those who were elected, what you see, and I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, but what you see amongst the Democrats is the face of the future of the United States political environment. More than half are women, faces of color. A Native American woman was elected, who I love. She describes herself as a 35th generation New Mexican. She's terrific. And a Muslim woman was elected. That's the face of the future of America. This is just 1 week, ladies and gentlemen. There's some or all of this kind of news virtually every week, and America finds itself these days lunging from one crisis to the next, and nearly all of them are self-inflicted. Now, so far, America's institutions are holding. So far, the vision of our founders, as reflected in our Constitution, of the intent to create a positive dynamic and a positive tension between the three branches of American government, the administrative branch, the legislature, and the judiciary. So far, that's holding, but it is distorted now. It's distorted now. And our hope is that this will self-adjust back to how our founders had envisaged this relationship unfolding. Now, I don't have to tell this audience, I don't have to tell Australians, that democracy as a form of government is very difficult. I hear the chuckles. That's not a commentary on my part, by the way. And that real democracies as a form of government are very fragile. They cannot pivot quickly, as can some illiberal or authoritarian societies, but they can react. And the result of the midterm election in the U.S., where the House of Representatives and a large number of state governorships are now in the hands of the Democratic Party, is a harbinger of things to come. So this brings me to American leadership in the 21st century, and increasingly with our friends overseas internationally, I try to make the point that there is a difference at this moment in American history between current U.S. leadership and traditional American leadership. It's useful to think in those terms. And also at this point, I have to make a disclaimer that the Brookings Institution is a nonpartisan institution in its work. Or put differently, we are politically neutral, but we are not values neutral. And as a public policy research institution, which is theoretically what a think tank is, we will not concentrate on the politics, but we will concentrate on the policy and the matters and the issues that help to shape that policy, trying to provide useful recommendations through our scholarship and our work, evidence-based, big data-supported research that can provide leaders with the kinds of policy options necessary to make the decisions of state. So with that, let me address what has changed so dramatically for the United States in the last 2 years in the context of American leadership in this century. President Trump's worldviews are vastly different from his predecessors. Under all modern American presidents in World War II, in the Cold War, and the post-Cold War era, the international rules-based system manifested in a network of multilateral arrangements, economic, political, and security. They created and they preserved globally broad stability in the world. The rule of law and fundamental adherence to the tenets of universal human rights were what defined the U.S.-led international collective approach to international relations, where we were simply, we, together, all of us as the community of nations, we were much greater than simply the sum or the arithmetic sum of our parts. We were transformational in our relationships together. And from that broad basis and reality, the U.S. conducted its international relations, supporting our allies and our friends and partners, and we made it clear to our enemies and those who would disturb these arrangements that there will be a cost to be paid by threatening behavior. So to be sure, our policies weren't always pure, and sometimes our failures were flat spectacular. But these arrangements generally kept the peace. They kept the peace and they fostered an international system of economic and political intercourse, the likes of which has never been seen before in human history. We did this together. Indeed, much of what China has become grew up in the protective shadow of that reality. So to this point in our modern history, this was what characterized American leadership in the world. Now, against this backdrop, the worldview of Donald Trump is very different. And under his version of U.S. leadership, we've seen a number of profound changes, actually, in the manner in which the U.S. interacts in the world. I'm going to detail 5 of them, but there are others. And I'll add that all of these points are either his stated positions or they are derived from his speeches or from his tweets. I'll add a bit of color, but not much because I want this to be a factual statement. First, he favors bilateralism over multilateralism, which in many respects explains his and American approaches, the U.S. approaches to multilateral organizations, economically, whether it's the G7 or the G20, whether it's NATO, the EU, or the United Nations. Second, he views U.S.-led international economic and security relationships as transactional, not transformational. And the U.S., we have always believed, was a transformational component in multilateral relationships around the world. Because that transformation was, we were all stronger together. We were all better because it was more than, as I said, the arithmetic sum of the parts. There was a synergy. There was a symbiosis. We were all better and transformed by these relationships. Problem, of course, is when it's transactional, and as he has said himself, he's working to get the best deal he can for America. And this has defined his worldview on a number of things. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think the world would be a very different place right now, frankly, in East Asia, if the Trans-Pacific Partnership had gone forward with the United States as a member. With NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, recently re-signed in Buenos Aires in conjunction with the G20. The Paris Climate Accord, which the U.S. withdrew from. And the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That agreement with the Russians and the Chinese and the British and the French and the EU and Germany and Iran to contain the nuclear capabilities of that nation, and we have withdrawn from that as well. Which brings me to the third point, is that he has placed America first to the extent that anyone really understands specifically what that means. It is largely manifested in his own terms that he will pursue fair trade, but does not in and of itself pursue free trade, which is a very different approach on the world stage. But I think the reality is, as we continue down this path, that America first is actually translating to America alone. And he made it very clear not long ago, the day he announced that the United States was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, when he said, "I was elected President of the United States. I wasn't elected President of the world. It's going to be America first." Fourth, he's been clear from the moment of his inaugural speech that the United States would not impose itself or its values on other states. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this for me is actually chilling. Much of my 4 decades, 42 years in uniform, I spent overseas trying to create the conditions where human rights mattered, where the human rights of women and minorities and children mattered. And not only is this an apparent abandonment of a traditional American role in championing human rights, but we've seen his open encouragement of illiberal and authoritarian strongmen, and by the way, they're always men, including Vladimir Putin, Rodrigo Duterte, President Erdogan, President Orban in Hungary, Kim Jong-un, Mohammed bin Salman, President Xi. This has sent mixed messages to our precious allies, Australia among them, and our other allies, and has emboldened petty dictators, authoritarians, and potential tyrants who feel, in some respects, now they can act with impunity. And we've seen it. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi is almost certain to be a conspicuous act of impunity, and the most recent example. And then finally, and fifth, one of our overseas fellows, one of our international fellows, watching the process of our politics under this administration unfold, made a very important observation. And he said that great violence has been done to the civility that has characterized the American political discourse, and which has traditionally, in diplomatic terms, set the conditions and set the standard internationally for the language to be used in conflict resolution and crisis management. Today, often in my country, when there is a difference of opinion, the absence of civility has created a polarization and the emergence of ethnic, racial, religious, and sexual tribalism that we have not seen before. If my opinion varies from yours, it starts with me being your enemy. And from there, the conversation deteriorates. So the bombast and the intemperate language, often delivered over Twitter, has alienated many of our friends and created a number of unnecessary crises. Last year, for example, and I know Australia paid close attention to this, last year, for example, the language that was surrounding the lead up to the US-North Korea summit in Singapore actually left me uncertain for the first time in my life as to whether the United States could find itself waging nuclear war in Northeast Asia. The theory that the Twitter rants forced Kim Jong-un to the table in Singapore is simply specious. He got, in Singapore, what no Kim has ever achieved before. Not Kim Il-sung, the grandfather, not Kim Jong-il, the father. What he got in Singapore was the acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear state by the United States and the president. And to this point, we've gotten nothing in return, except, so some of you in the intelligence community know that we're now discovering multiple new ballistic missile launch sites in North Korea. So these are 5 hard truths, 5 realities that in many ways defines U.S. leadership in the world today versus traditional American leadership with which we've been accustomed. And while I'm not going to comment on the politics versus the policies of the moment, these present those present tonight within the sound of my voice. I will say this, and that is that I firmly believe that while we're in a moment of difficulty today, that I believe that we will emerge from this moment and we will see constructive American re-engagement and an attempt once again to exert the kind of leadership that we both feel we should exert, but also I believe our international partners seek from us. And to me, the question isn't really whether America will become re-engaged or seek to be a part of this process. My concern is how much the world will have changed because of this moment, perhaps irretrievably changed in reaction to this era of American nationalism and a stated policy of America first. I think we'll return. The question is, will the world want us to? So against this sobering backdrop, what are some of the challenges that we're going to face in this 21st century environment? So let me start by acknowledging that, frankly, the environment that President Trump inherited when he was inaugurated on 20th of January 2017 was a difficult environment. He was handed a pretty tough hand. To that extent, he has had to deal with a Middle East in turmoil, an ongoing ISIS conflict, unresolved Middle East peace, and the unfinished business of the Afghan war. He's been confronted with a China which is manifestly unfair in many of its trading practices, and especially, and I had the opportunity to spend some time with Ross Babbage this afternoon, who's probably one of the premier authorities on contemporary China, especially in the aftermath of the 19th Party Congress recently in China, where the empowerment of Xi Jinping may create the environment in which he believes he can now double down on Chinese power in the presence of an America that doesn't find its way. He was confronted by a hostile Russia on many fronts, a North Korea with probably an intercontinental ballistic missile that can reach the continental United States, and multiple nuclear warheads. And internally in the U.S., he's had to deal with numerous unresolved economic and social issues which have deeply affected the American lower middle class, a large segment of which is the white population that has felt disenfranchised from the processes and the progress of government in recent years. And recognizing that disenfranchisement and recognizing that disaffection, he was able ultimately to polarize them into a very powerful voting base. So he's been dealt a pretty tough hand. So as I talk about American leadership in the 21st century, I think it's useful to frame it more in the context of questions than declarative statements. First, how will the U.S. be positioned in the 21st century vis-a-vis the other powers, the major powers of China and India and Russia and Europe, and something that we're spending a lot of time studying at Brookings today called the rise of digital governance? And I'll come to that in a moment. And second, how will the U.S. manage the events of the Middle East, which continue in turmoil unabated, and the conflict and the economic migration that in many respects has actually destabilized the politics of Europe? What will be the role of the United States in that region as well? In terms of great power relations, obviously shaping the 21st century relationship, China is the most urgent. At Brookings, we believe the U.S.-China relationship may be described as the consequential relationship of the 21st century. We talk about the 4 C's, letter C's, when we talk about our relationship with China. First, seek with China areas of common interest where cooperation could occur. There's a large capacity for that. But recognize that much of the relationship with China today could be described as a competitive relationship, competitive across many different measures. And where we should seek opportunity from the competition. We should also expect that that competition could create for us the third C, which is confrontation. And we must understand how to manage confrontation with China, because the fourth C is conflict. And no one's interest will be served if there is open conflict between the United States and China. And there are a number of flashpoints in this region. Not just the South China Sea, but the unresolved issues associated with Taiwan. And the confusion, frankly, that the United States has sown. We, as you know, have adhered to a one China policy for many years. And our explicit policy was the United States does not support Taiwan independence. Those words are exactly from our policy. We do not support Taiwan independence. But we oppose those actions which will forcibly reunite Taiwan with China apart from the democratic processes of the Taiwan people. Yet we have now positioned an embassy in Taipei, and we're pushing destroyers through the straits, the Taiwan Strait. It's an interesting time. And so there are multiple flashpoints, and we have to carefully manage the potential for confrontation and ultimately from that conflict. The problem today with the Chinese relationship is that it is shaped less by a comprehensive U.S.-China policy than it is profoundly dominated by economic issues associated with trade, which are at the heart of the issue, and in the context further illustrated or exacerbated by this thing called the easy trade war, which we thought we would get into with the Chinese. Now, the G20 dinner, where President Trump and President Xi had a potentially positive outcome, appears to have created an environment where we have a 90-day pause in escalating the U.S. tariff jump from a 10% tariff to a 25% tariff on as much as $200 billion of Chinese products. 90 days to solve this. I think we've all seen that deadlines like that are pretty tough to meet. I don't think we will. It's not going to pan out. Today in the U.S., it was very difficult for President Trump's economic advisors to actually explain what happened at that dinner. So we've got some challenges. This is on top of the other tensions I just mentioned, the potential flashpoints in the region: Taiwan, the South China Sea, Chinese support to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, the Belt and Road Initiative, development competition in the developing world. The list is long and it's lengthening. And as we deal with China, we need to consider several factors which I think are very important in helping to guide, at least the United States, helping to guide our considerations with respect to China. The first is, we cannot contain China. Now, I don't know necessarily how this community would view this, but for us, it was a bad policy a generation ago as we considered containing China, and it's even a worse policy today. The problem is there are elements today in Washington who believe that China must be both confronted and contained, when the reality, of course, is that as you consider the emergence of China into the power that it has become, politically, economically, now militarily, the engagement of China and the shaping of the relationships to the benefit of all the parties has got to be our premier objective, and then thereafter take steps that are necessary to defend ourselves in the collective nature that I talked about before. The second area is, don't force our allies and partners in the region to choose between China and the United States. Our best diplomacy should be oriented on being assertive with China, not confrontational, but supportive of our partners in the region. To that end, I see that the U.S.-Australian relationship remaining strong and remaining an important touchstone for the means to have influence in the region with respect to China. And happily, I think many of you know, that President Trump has nominated an excellent individual to be the next U.S. ambassador to Australia. His name is A.B. Culverhouse, who has a long tradition with George H.W. Bush and that administration. So he comes with a lot of experience, and he's a very good man. I think you will find him to be a very useful partner. The third area is that I don't believe that conflict with China is inevitable. And in the United States, you have a number of writers who talk about the trend of statistics, the long-term relationships between status quo powers, the U.S., and rising powers, China. There will be a very high statistical likelihood that the rising power will eventually challenge the status quo power, or the status quo power will seek to contain the emergence of the rising power, ultimately generating conflict. And Graham Allison at Harvard has called this, in his book about China, the Thucydides trap. And you would not imagine how much trouble I had spelling that. I don't believe either that it is inevitable, and I also don't believe that the U.S. should be pursuing it. But there are those who believe that some part of our confrontation with China may require some kinetic dimension. And it's also not clear, and I think this is really important. Again, Ross and I talked about it this afternoon. It's not clear to me with the ascension of President Xi in the aftermath of the 19th Party Congress where China is headed in the context of a continuity of leadership. As I think you know, there have only been 3 names mentioned in the Chinese Constitution: Chairman Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and now Xi Jinping. He's actually quoted now in the Constitution. That's not insignificant, and it sends an extraordinarily powerful message. He has also consolidated power, more power around his presidency than any Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. And it would appear that term limits have been taken off his office, although some of you would know better than I. This is a very different environment for the leader of China and the immediate inner circle that surrounds him. And so whether this places China and Xi and the Chinese Communist Party on a collision course with the U.S., or does it put it on a path for expanded cooperation, we don't know yet. But I think what we do know is that the amount of trade space that President Xi has empowered as he is, and with higher Chinese expectations for Chinese leadership in the world, vis-a-vis the United States, we don't know how much trade space he actually has to deal with the United States right now in this trade war. Now, the U.S. and the Soviet Cold War was an ideological struggle with a thermonuclear superpower, but an economic pygmy, the Russians. Deng Xiaoping saw this. He saw that an ideological struggle of China with the United States would be a constant source of confrontation and would preclude the potential for China to achieve economic power. And so, as he said, we will achieve our economic power and hide our true capabilities. Under Deng and his successors, the U.S. and the China relationship was defined far more by our shared economic interests rather than our political differences. Very wise. And yes, there are prominent tensions between us today, on human rights issues in particular. But we have the capacity to talk, and our economies created a basis for extensive, broad-based engagement between our peoples. But now, that dimension of the relationship is under direct attack, and the words trade war carry a very different connotation in Beijing than it does in Washington. And other terms that we've used flippantly with respect to the Chinese have left the Chinese very concerned about the direction of the United States. And I will tell you that we wonder whether the relationship with the United States and China is at a tipping point. Recently, a delegation of very senior Chinese came to the United States, led by a very senior Chinese official. Many of you know her in this room. And she visited think tanks and entities around the United States in New York City and in Washington. And when they arrived at Brookings, her first question was, Has the U.S.-China relationship moved beyond a tipping point? Because the answer to that question either can fill you with hope or create a sense of despair. Now, my own view is it hasn't. But the fact that they are in the United States asking that question portrays the seriousness in their mind of the trajectory that our two nations may be on in the context of confrontation and ultimately the potential for conflict. Now, time this evening really precludes my addressing every component of what I would want to lay out, except to say that while we view the U.S.-China relationship as the consequential relationship of the 21st century, in the work that we're doing at Brookings, we see the U.S.-Indian relationship as the indispensable relationship of the 21st century. But we think that that relationship is still years in the making, and our capacities right now to exert the level of attention we'd like to put into this is really limited. But the desire would be that India, in the context of the great powers emerging in the 21st century, could in fact be a major factor in the U.S. Indo-Pacific policy regime. Turning briefly to Russia, we view Russia, frankly, as a hostile state. And while it's governed by Vladimir Putin, we don't anticipate any change in that behavior. Its actions from Crimea to the Donbass, the Black Sea, its unqualified support of Bashar al-Assad, its strategic influence operations with a world-class cyber backup against the U.S. and European politics have marked it for us as a threat at a time when our own president seeks a relationship with Vladimir Putin and seeks to change the nature of the U.S.-Russian narrative. And the Helsinki summit was actually quite a setback for us in that regard. For the foreseeable future, the U.S. and the European relationship will continue to be at the heart of our identity as a nation. But with this administration disinclined to multilateralism and its ambivalence towards NATO, with the EU and the UK in the throes of Brexit, and with other severe economic stresses within the European Union and a general drift of politics in Europe towards an illiberal right polarization, our concern is that the transatlantic relationship is fraying and will not get better in the near future. And finally, Brookings is tackling something we think is an important emerging trend in the 21st century, the rise of what we call digital governance, a system of governance, if you will, that operates in direct competition to traditional principles of Westphalian governance. The one exists increasingly in the all-pervasive cyber domain of the 21st century, while the other continues to exist in the physical domain of traditional governance. And given the role of the internet and social media and the explosion of the availability of network-capable devices, the capacity of the digital giants in the world today to touch vast swaths of the global population, in effect leveraging their attention and turning their attention and loyalties into being digital citizens associated with the private sector than physical citizens of a Westphalian government, that's a trend that we must observe closely, because it can have profound effects on definitions of sovereignty as we go forward. And you only had to see in the US the testimony of Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook on Capitol Hill with the US Senate and how the conversation went just like this. One, a very smooth, very polished, very civil explanation of digital governance. The other, perfect example of Westphalian government, unable to understand a bit of what he was saying. And it's a challenge that we have to face. Now, shifting a bit to the other area that I talked about, and I've just got a few more minutes, to talk about U.S. and American leadership in the Middle East, because this is essential for us. And we and Australia have been there since 9/11. And that partnership is very powerful and very effective. The so-called Arab Spring of 2010 and 2011 signaled the widespread failure of Arab governance in the region and set in motion a series of seismic events that either upended multiple regimes, created ongoing civil wars, and shook the remaining states to their core. The Syrian and the Yemeni civil wars are two of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes in the world today. And the numbers of displaced persons and migration as a result of conflict in the region is the largest since the Second World War. There's no easy resolution in sight for either of them. And even if both conflicts were solved tonight and the guns fell silent, the butcher's bill for the reconstruction of these nations and the education of children that haven't been in a classroom for sometimes 6 years, and the societal trauma that these societies, these elements have faced, will long color the dimensions of the Middle East. And then we have the ongoing cold and hot war between the Saudi-led Sunni states and Iran, which will continue to define many of the dynamics that we will face in the region. Indeed, I tell my scholars, if you're going to attempt to do research on a particular dimension of the Middle East, please take one step back and consider how the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni states create the initial membrane for your consideration about what's happening. Because if you go straight to the issue, and you will probably miss that there is an origin somewhere in that issue, in that Cold War environment. And to that end, as the United States under this president, very early in his tenure, aligned ourselves unambiguously with the Saudis, and in particular with Mohammed bin Salman, we have clearly joined up in our policy process, not just with them, but clearly a series of policy decisions with respect to how we will deal with Iran in the region, to include walking away from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which I think may be one of the biggest policy mistakes that we've made in a very long time. And then finally, under this administration, we're seeking the much anticipated Kushner-led so-called deal of the century, defining the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and it continues to languish. And it languishes because of difficulties with the Israeli government, difficulties now with Mohammed bin Salman, a problem with capacity for the Palestinians. I was eye-deep in it for a long time. It is as hard as second-grade math, which was the hardest 2 years of my life. There's only one solution that's going to work, and that's a two-state outcome. And those who believe that a bi-national outcome, and our administration now proclaims that the two-state outcome is preferable to us if it's preferable to them, the bi-national outcome is, I think, a recipe for the failure of the Zionist vision of a democratic Jewish state. And for some, Zionism is a pejorative term. I don't see it that way. Zionism ultimately seeks a democratic Jewish state, and it will be impossible in a binational arrangement to have one element of the population which will eventually surpass the Jewish element of the population to be disenfranchised from the political processes where it will not be, in the end, a Zionist state. So it's a very difficult problem. To be fair to the president, he inherited some very difficult vertical diplomatic and security challenges. And with that regard, his relationship with Mohammed bin Salman, moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, zeroing our commitment to UNRWA, $300 million ultimately to support the Palestinians, walking away from the JCPOA. These are problems that will challenge us for a long time to come. Now, in the few minutes, and I do hope you forget everything I said, in the few minutes that we've had to talk tonight, I've sought to portray that this is a nearly wicked problem that we face in the United States, which is in essence the in-stride shift from traditional American leadership to an era that's profoundly different in our definition of multilateralism, in the relationships of states, in the role of America in the world, and ultimately how we will deal with our friends. It's unknown what the long-term effects of this presidency will be. But the reality is that the challenges we face as a community of nations are crowding in on us more and more every day. And the absence of U.S. leadership in helping to solve these problems will severely constrain multilateral approaches, while also creating openings, frankly, for alternative sources of influence. And we're seeing that in many places. And those of us who work these issues virtually every day, we're confident that there will come a day after. There will be a day after of this moment, where traditional American leadership will be broadly synchronous again with U.S. leadership. And as I said before, our level of confidence is high in that regard. Our level of confidence is high that we will seek to be re-engaged in the manner that you've both seen us in the past and you expect us to be in the future. But the question isn't whether we'll do that again. The question is, can we repair the damage that has occurred by those who have chosen to go their own way because the American alternative was either unavailable or unthinkable. So the irony is that the U.S. is going to need help in restoring these relationships. And in that regard, allies and friends will, in a very real way, become keepers of the flames of our long-term bilateral relationships. In that context, the Five Eyes countries, and in particular Australia, those relationships are solid, and I think they will continue to be very solid and very much the cornerstones of American future leadership. In other areas, though, it will be problematic and may, in fact, be impossible to restore the status quo ante with other countries or organizations who, frankly, taken other choices and other opportunities. So I said at the beginning of my remarks this evening that if Americans and the English are two people uniquely separated by a common language, I hope history will record that Americans and Australians were uniquely united in a common purpose. In the environment that's coming, a day after environment that's coming, there will be almost no more important relationship for America than that with Australia. It'll be a relationship which I pray and I hope will continue to increase that common purpose that we have seen as two peoples, that will not just benefit us, but will benefit in the reckoning of history, the great aggregation of good in this world and the human experiment. So I'm sorry for going on so long. This was an important conversation for me, to be in the presence of our closest friends on the planet, to confront the realities that we faced politically today, but to assure you that I do believe that there will be a time in the future where the synchronization between U.S. and American leadership and this close relationship with Australia will accomplish that which we hope to pursue in the 21st century. So thank you very much for your time this evening, and thank you for your attention.